Welcome back to my channel everyone. I'm Charles from Charles and Photography. Now I've owned my Nikon D500 for quite a while now, I think just over a year, and in that time I've photographed wildlife, landscapes and nightscape images. And most of the time when I've done wildlife videos, I state how I set up my Nikon D500 to shoot wildlife. And I've had some comments from people stating, how do I set up my Nikon D500 when I'm shooting landscapes or when I'm shooting nightscape images? And the D500 has a photo menu bank where you can actually program 4 types of menus for different settings in your Nikon D500. So people are saying, do you use these menu banks or do you set up your camera a different way? Well, I've looked at using the menu banks and I've found that although you can actually set some settings, you can't set all your settings. So I had to come up with a system that was quite easy for me to adapt from wildlife to landscapes and to nightscape images. I was wanting to come up with a system that was very easy so I could change quite quickly from my wildlife settings to my landscape settings. So after a while of actually trying a few different methods of setting up the camera, I've come up with a process that I think is quite easy, especially if you're just shooting landscape and wildlife images. Nightscape images, you're not in a hurry to take anything, so we're shooting in manual. It's very easy if you want to adjust your white balance and all that with just a couple of dials. But if I'm out and about and I'm shooting landscapes and all of a sudden I want to shoot a bird or a lizard or something like that, I wanted to find a way that I could quickly swap from one set of settings to another. So this is what I found. So first I went into the picture controls settings. Now I've done a video just on picture controls and I'll link it up here now so you can actually look how to actually set up your picture controls. But I've set mine to landscape because I like having an idea of what my image will look like when I actually process it. So I set up the picture profiles first. Then I go into the auto ISO settings and I set that to a minimum of ISO 100 and a maximum of ISO 4000. But I leave the auto ISO off. I don't turn it on inside the menu. Now that is the only thing that I do in the menu. The rest I do on the top of the dials here. For my metering, most of the time I'm shooting in matrix metering for landscapes. But when it comes to wildlife, I actually use center weighted. Adjusting the metering, if I wanted to, it's just one touch of the metering button here and I'm going from matrix to center weighted. Very easy to do. Now when it comes to the autofocus system, we have AFS-S, which means single, AFS-C, which is continuous. This is where I leave my camera all the time. AFS-C, continuous, because I use back button focus. Now, if you haven't set up your Nikon D500 for back button focusing, there's a video up here that you can watch. This is such a useful tool to use. So this is where AFS and AFC don't matter at all, because if I'm shooting landscapes, I use back button focusing because once it's focused, I'm not going to hold the back button focus button continuously. But when I'm shooting wildlife, then I can hold it. So there is no difference between using AFS or AFS-C. So this is why I leave it on AFC all the time. It makes no difference. You can try it out for yourself, but you'll find it makes no difference at all. Even in wildlife, I use single point focus. I find that that's the best way to do it. Now, the few times that I will need group focus for wildlife, so if it's a very big bird flying around and the flying is very erratic and I don't want to miss a shot, then I will quickly move it to group focus. But I found that maybe in the last year, I've had to do this 2 or 3 times. So I leave it in AFC all the time, and the setting is single point focus, because whether I shoot landscape, wildlife or nightscape images, single point is what I use. This might be different for you, but try it out and you will find that 9 times out of 10 this will be the best setting to use. When it comes to quality, I shoot in RAW all the time, but in the last 6 months, because I'm doing a lot more YouTube videos, I might want to use some of the photos that I'm taking for a YouTube tutorial. So I shoot RAW and JPEG in normal. I just want a file big enough that I can actually display in the video, so I choose normal for my JPEG. This is why I actually set the picture controls to landscape, because the photos have been processed in the camera just to give me a bit more vibrance, a bit more saturation, a little bit more contrast and sharpness, so they actually look good straight off the camera. I don't need to do any editing. This is why I shoot in JPEG and in RAW. White balance is another thing. Now, white balance here, we've just got the white balance button here. 80% of the time during the day I use just auto white balance. For my wildlife images, when I'm out with my family, it's always in auto white balance. The only time that I shoot manual white balance is at night when I'm shooting nightscape images, because 9 times out of 10 when I'm shooting at night, I'm using my Nikon 11 to 20 millimeter lens, and I've got a clear night filter on the lens to actually reduce the amount of light pollution that I'm actually seeing on the camera. But this has the problem of cooling my images down. So I use the manual white balance to actually bring it back to where I think it should be. And the reason I do this, I could leave it in auto white balance and just say, okay, I'm just looking at the shot, whether it's correctly exposed, whether it's sharp, properly focused. But I'm one of these old school people that I really like to have a good idea of what the picture would look like when I edit it in Adobe Lightroom. This is why for sunrise and sunsets and nightscape images, I will use manual white balance. It's very easy to do. It's just tap the button here, one turn of the dial, and I'm going from auto to manual white balance. This is, I've found, the easiest way of setting up my camera. And the last part is ISO. Because the ISO button is located up here, the only time I use auto ISO is when I'm shooting wildlife. So as soon as I put this lens on, before I even leave home, all I do is turn the camera on, press the ISO button, and using the front dial, turn it from manual ISO to auto ISO. This is where, because I've pre-programmed it in the menu, that the minimum ISO is 100 and the maximum ISO is 4000, I don't have to worry about ISO when I'm out and about, because I shoot in manual mode when I'm shooting wildlife. I just dial in manual, put it on continuous slow, and then I can leave the aperture alone, because if you watch some of my wildlife videos, you'll know that using the Nikon 200 to 500 f5.6, I shoot wide open all the time. The only time that I will ever shoot higher than f5.6 is if it's a stationary bird and there might be a couple of birds very close to it, let's say a nesting white ibis with some chicks around. I just want a little bit more depth of field to cover the nesting site, then I may go up to f8, but 90% of the time I'm shooting wide open at f5.6. So once it's set at f5.6, I leave it alone and I just control my shutter speed to the conditions that I'm shooting. So if it's going to be a bird in flight, or let's say I'm looking at an egret that's just about ready to catch a fish, that's hunting for food, I will increase the shutter speed very quickly to, let's say, 0.02 of a second or 2.5 thousandths for a second. The ISO just runs wild. It can go up to ISO 4000. It's not a big deal. This camera will handle this without a problem at all. I just want to show you today, it is so easy to set up this camera for different types of photography, whether you're shooting landscapes, wildlife, or nightscape images. Just a couple of minutes setting up the menu for your picture profiles, for your ISO. That's all you need to do. The rest here is just done on the dials for you. So give it a try. Use the settings that I've just told you and see whether these settings will actually suit your type of photography. If you're new to the D500, give my settings a try. Set it up the way that I've just mentioned, and if you find a problem or if you have a better way of setting up your Nikon D500, that's fine. Leave it in the comment box below. I'd really like to know how you set up your Nikon D500 to quickly change from landscape to wildlife or to nightscape images. So if this video has been of benefit to you, give me a thumbs up. I'd appreciate if you subscribe to my YouTube channel. Stay safe, enjoy your photography, and I'll see you next time.